Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
Ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, all across America, people are calling our cable providers, and they're asking if they can get a refund for C-SPAN coverage of the Senate. There seems to be some concerns that there's no serious debate underway, no serious votes being taken, and the hours just continue to flow by. And I can understand the frustration of the American public watching this chamber. We're going through a 30-hour interval. The Senate is kind of designed on 30-hour intervals, and this is the 30-hour interval before we enter the next 30-hour interval in the hopes that we will ultimately get to a vote. Does it have to be this way? Of course not. It shouldn't be this way. I understand the depth of feeling that some senators have about a variety of issues, and they've come to the floor to express them. In fact, I even agree with some of their positions. But there comes a point where you have to say, all right, I didn't win my battle today. I'm not going to get my day in court. Let's at least go on with the business of the Senate, because you see we have an important responsibility ahead of us. Senator Murray just spoke before me. She's chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. She has a Herculean task, and she's up to it. In fact, she's shown herself to be a very able leader of a budget committee in producing a budget proposal for the next fiscal year. And it's a balanced proposal. It's one that I think is sensible. Now, I have some background in this, at least by way of avocation. Having been a member of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, I sat through a year of committee hearings and debates that led to a vote on a proposal to reduce the budget deficit. So I've heard some of the arguments that have been made on both sides. I then joined a bipartisan group of senators, a so-called Gang of Eight, and we sat down to try to do the same. And we spent over a year doing exactly that. So I kind of know where this comes down. And my approach to this, an approach which is being followed by Senator Murray with her proposed Democratic budget resolution, is yes, the deficit is a serious problem. The debt of America is a serious problem. When you borrow 40 cents for every dollar you spend, it's unsustainable. So we have to deal with that issue and deal with it honestly. But first and foremost, let's do it in a fashion that builds the American economy, that creates good-paying jobs. You know, if you want to find your way out of a deficit, put people to work first when they're paying taxes as opposed to drawing benefits. That really tips the scales in the right direction in dealing with the deficit. So what the Murray budget does, the Democratic budget resolution will do, is to make investments in the things that do produce jobs in America, and they're very obvious. Education. Who's going to argue with that one? Is there a person standing in the Senate who didn't rely on their own education and training to progress in life? And didn't you tell your son and daughter the same thing when they were making their life choices? Stay in school, get a good education. So education is an investment part of the Democratic budget resolution. Secondly, the notion of research and innovation. One of the most heartbreaking parts of sequestration, to me, was when we took $1.6 billion away from the National Institutes of Health. That is the organization that does the medical research to find new cures, new vaccines, new medical devices, so that people can survive when they have a diagnosis that could be fatal, to make sure that children have a chance at a full life. We're cutting that in the name of budget deficit reduction, and that is troubling. The third area is infrastructure. I've spent the entire day with contractors from my state of Illinois, people who represent the road builders, for example, bridge builders. They believe, and I do too, that investment in infrastructure pays off over generations. We just had a meeting on the waterway system. The Mississippi River is such an important part of national commerce. We need to improve the dams and the locks on the Mississippi and the adjoining rivers, such as the Illinois. So the Murray budget deals with investments, investments to build the economy, investments to spark economic growth. But then it goes on to seriously reduce the deficit. The goal in this, of course, is to not only meet but surpass the goal of the Simpson-Bowles Budget Commission in terms of deficit reduction. The way that Senator Murray does it, of course, is in a balanced approach, which includes spending cuts, which must be part of it, as well as revenue. I think that that is the sensible approach to it. Unfortunately, on the other side, the argument's made that we just can't raise any more revenue. I know better. Anyone who's taken a close look at the tax code in America realizes that we literally forgive tax obligations of over $1 trillion a year in our tax code, some of them very worthy. The deduction for a home mortgage, for example, deductions for charitable contributions, for example. These things are worthy of our tax code. But there are other things which cannot even be explained. Why in the world would we put in our tax code a provision which says if American business wants to move jobs overseas, we will give them a tax break to do it? I don't think so. You know, that should be a decision, if they make it, with no encouragement from our tax code. Rather, let's encourage businesses to stay in the United States. Similarly, Senator Carl Levin of Michigan has really made a concerted effort to investigate and expose the offshore tax havens that cost us over $300 billion a year in taxes owed to the United States. People that park their money in faraway places with strange-sounding names end up escaping tax liability. Now, why do we let that happen? The average family across America, the average business across America can't escape and doesn't even try to escape its liability. And yet we build into the tax codes these Cayman Island little fiascos and Bermuda and all the other places they head to. We could put an end to that in a hurry and bring revenue back to the United States to reduce the deficit. So what Senator Murray and the Budget Committee talk about is generating revenue to reduce the deficit and making spending cuts. In addition, Senator Murray and the Budget Committee will face the entitlement issues. They're important. If you just left the entitlements without change, the cost of health care would lead us to further bankruptcy in America. They are addressing them, as we should. While protecting the integrity of the programs, they're finding ways to save money to reach the goal. Wouldn't this be a great debate to have on the floor of the Senate? To have that budget resolution before us? To actually have some votes on amendments? Well, it would be. But unfortunately, because of the objection of several Republican senators, we can't get to it. So the clock is continuing to turn, and we're watching the hours slip away, and now we're facing the possibility of a weekend session because one or two senators don't want us to bring this matter to a vote. That's unfortunate. It may be their right to exercise that kind of power in the Senate, but it isn't fair. It isn't fair to this institution or to the American people who count on us to do more than just waste time on the Senate floor. They count on us to use our time to solve problems. So I urge my colleagues on the Republican side who are holding up these votes, who are engaged in this filibuster, for goodness sakes, let's move on. Let's vote on the continuing resolution, and let's start the debate, the important debate on the budget resolution. Let's get this done. For the longest time, we were preached to by members on the other side about no budget resolution. I even heard a speech today from my friend from Texas, a senior senator, talking about how derelict we've been in not bringing up a budget resolution. We want to. We're being stopped by Republican senators. They're the ones who won't let us bring this to a vote. I hope they'll change their mind soon. I'd like to spend next week back in Illinois and with my family, as most senators would, during Passover and the Easter seasons. More importantly, I'd like to get my job done before that happens. And to do that, we ought to be working on the floor right now. Instead of an empty floor, it should be a floor filled with senators debating the issues and voting on them. I think that's what we were elected to do. And I think the people on C-SPAN would like to see some activity on the Senate floor. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte.
The pending business here in the Senate is spending for this fiscal year, 2013, through September. The House, on the other side of the Capitol, the House is dealing with the budget for 2014. The Hill writing that Speaker Boehner steered clear of endorsing a conservative alternative to the House Republican budget today, saying that the only proposal, authored by Representative Paul Ryan, would be the one to pass the House this week. We're going to watch now Republicans, including Representative Ryan, talking on the Capitol Hill today.
That's interesting. Morning, everybody. This is a good week for House Republicans because this is the week where we bring to the country a responsible, balanced budget. The reason we are balancing our budget is because it is a necessary means to an end, which is to improve people's lives. Our balanced budget plan balances the budget without raising taxes. We're actually growing the economy. It fosters a healthier, stronger economy so we can create more jobs. There's an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today where two Stanford economists say that this budget, if enacted, would grow the economy faster first year and the last year. Almost $1,400 would accrue to a household in the first year, $4,000 for a family in the last year of the budget. Because if we balance the budget by getting government to live within its means, that produces certainty. If we reform the tax code, open up our energy, if we get spending under control and reform our entitlements so that people can count on the promises that government has made them, that helps the economy. That improves people's lives. This stands in stark contrast to the budgets that the Democrats are bringing forward. If there's one consistent theme you see with all the various budgets the Democrats are bringing forward, including the Senate budget introduced by Senator Patty Murray, it is this. It proposes even higher taxes. It proposes deep cuts to national security, more provider cuts to Medicare, only to be outdone by even higher spending increases. And so the one thing we've seen from the Democratic budgets here is $1 trillion in higher taxes or higher, only outdone by even higher spending than if we did nothing. Taxing more, borrowing more, and spending more is not a path to prosperity. It is not going to give us a healthy economy. This is why we're proposing a responsible, balanced budget. The only difference between the Democrats in the Congress and the Republicans is in the budgets we're passing, but at least we're bringing budgets forward. The President hasn't even proposed a budget yet. The law requires that the President of the United States submit his budget in the first Monday in February, and he is missing in action. That is not leadership. That is ducking responsibility. We are at least bringing our budgets to the floor, showing the American people how we would govern. And we are showing here is a responsible path to a balanced budget, which we think is far better than yet another tax increase and more spending and borrowing, which would evolve into a debt crisis. But at least we're showing leadership. We would like to see some similar leadership come from other folks around town. With that, I'd like to introduce the Speaker.
Well, I want to thank Chairman Ryan and members of our Budget Committee for a job well done. This is the third year that we've brought forward as a majority a plan to balance the budget. This budget will, in fact, balance in 10 years. And for American families, a balanced budget means more jobs. It means more opportunities. It means affordable energy. And it also means a more secure retirement. Listen, we balanced the budget back in the mid-'90s along with President Bill Clinton. And out of that plan, we actually did balance the budget and led to one of the healthiest economies we've had. President Obama should do likewise. Work with the Republicans in Congress together to put forward a plan that will, in fact, balance the budget and help American families enjoy real prosperity and a much more secure retirement.
Good morning. This is a good week for House Republicans. This is also a week of contrast. Our budget balances in 10 years. Their budget never balances and raises $1 trillion worth of taxes. I think the question for the American people is, which budget actually helps? Which helps people? Well, I would say that a balanced budget is going to help grow our economy and provide the certainty needed to so many people out there looking for the government to do the very same thing they're having to do at home. Which budget helps those who are in need? Our budget provides a prescription to save the social safety nets of Medicare, of Medicaid. Theirs doesn't. Theirs brings about the demise of those programs. Which budget brings about the kind of tax reform that people want in this country? Lower rates, fair and simpler tax code. Our budget does that. Theirs raises taxes to the tune of almost $1 trillion. The choice is clear. Our budget is pro-growth. It will help people get back to work. It will help those in need. And that's why we're going to have a great vote this week on the floor in the House.
Well, as I look out, only one got the green tie memo, so the rest of us did. But you're going to hear some of the same things from all of us, because there's a direct contrast between where we are going and where the Democrats are going. Either you want more of the tax and spend, or you want a future that balances. The question is always why for one or the other. If you go with the Democrats' tax and spend, you're going to get some of the same economy that you've had right now. You're going to lose more of your paycheck, which every person working today has. If you go to the other path, the path to growth and prosperity, don't take our word for it. Take the two economists sitting out at Stanford. You may have heard of that university sitting out in California. They modeled it. They went out and said, what would this budget do? They said by 2014 you'll have 1% of GDP growth. That means $1,500 to every household. For out years you'd have 3% growth, meaning almost $4,000 to every household.
Additional growth.
So, which future do you pick? Growth or more tax and spend? If you don't agree with them, ask Paul.
The question is, have you heard of that university called Gonzaga from Spokane? And if you haven't, you're going to, anyway. So last week, the President articulated his plan on the budget, and he said, my goal is not to chase a balanced budget just for the sake of balance. We are not going to balance the budget in 10 years. And as has been mentioned this morning, our budget balances in 10 years. And why that is important is because it's important in improving the lives of every person in this country and allowing them to keep more money in their pocketbooks. It also will help grow our economy, help create jobs. Our plan is a plan to grow the economy. And what we're seeing on the other side from the Senate, by the Democrats, it's a plan that's going to grow one thing, and that's the national debt. So at a time when many seniors are worried about their benefits, and we see many young people that are having trouble finding jobs after they graduate from college, ours is a plan that is going to give them the certainty and that is going to help them find those jobs because it's going to help grow the economy. And what we need from the President and what we need from the Senate Democrats is a plan to join us in this effort that's going to help improve the lives of Americans all across this country.
As one of the few CPAs in this town, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a bigger tax budget or economic geek than me. There's nothing that I enjoy more than having a discussion about debt-to-equity ratios and 302B allocations and the difference between getting to primary balance as opposed to actually balancing the budget. But I've been told that normal people don't enjoy those discussions. So I can tell you one thing that normal people do have in common with me, and that is I think they agree that the President is wrong when he thinks balancing the budget isn't a priority. They get it. They know that every family has to balance their budget, every business, every hospital, every school district, every state and local government has to balance their budget. And I think they're confused as to why the Democrats' budget never achieves balance and why the President doesn't make it a priority. This affects real lives. It affects them based on the inflation rate. When you've got high debt ratios, it affects the cost of living.
When the Majority Leader came to the floor to propose a unanimous consent request that we move forward with this continuing resolution, he's right, we should move forward with this. But I was puzzled by the fact that he said we've been standing around here now looking at each other and we're not doing anything. Well, we haven't done anything for the past 36 hours while we're trying to figure out who has the right to offer an amendment and whether that amendment will be agreed to in part of this unanimous consent request, limiting the time. The problem here is that, you know, we came to the Senate believing that each senator had the right to offer any amendment. That's what we're here for, to debate that amendment and then take a vote on that amendment. The winners pass the amendment and we move on. So it's not a question of I won't offer my amendment unless I pass it. Let's debate it, see how each of us votes, and then go forward. But the Majority Leader essentially has simply said he will decide how many amendments will be offered and which amendments won't be offered, denying senators the opportunity to bring their amendment to the floor. And so there was an objection to his request to move forward because senators had been denied that opportunity. That's really not what the Senate's all about. That's not what people elected us to do. We've been in an empty chamber here, basically talking to no one, or at best to each other, and not moving forward with funding this government for the next 6 months in this fiscal year. Not a small matter. So we're all ready to go forward, but we would like to have the right, particularly as a minority, to offer our amendments to this resolution which provides for this funding. Now, I don't know how I'm going to vote on all these because some of them I'm not even sure what would be brought forward. But we're here to evaluate those, to make our best judgment, to vote our yay and nay or nay, to be able to explain to the people back home why we voted that way, And then they get to decide whether they want to send this back for another term or whether they think we did the right thing. Apparently, the majority leader has some problems with some of these proposed amendments. Maybe he doesn't want his members to have to vote on it because it's a tough vote politically. Well, what are we here for? We're not here for just to find consensus on everything that goes forward. We have different points of view, and it's understood that we won't always have consent to pass everything that's brought forward. And we ought to be debating that. There's different visions here about how we ought to go forward. But the solution to the problem of moving forward and getting this spending bill in place, which we obviously have to do, is to simply give members the opportunity to propose their amendments, vote on them, debate, vote, and move on. So over these last 36 hours, how many of these amendments could we have been debating and voting on? We probably could have cleared out all the amendments that were proposed by various members easily in half at that time or much less. And that's why we're here. We're in a divided government, so there's going to be two sides to each issue. But this standing around and then deciding, having one person, the majority leader, decide whether or not he will subject his members to a vote because he thinks that might put them in a difficult political situation, you know, it works both ways. His side can offer their amendments. We can offer our amendments. Hopefully we're offering amendments for the good of the country and not some for political gain or gotcha amendments. But nevertheless, that is the right of a senator to offer whatever amendment he or she deems best in his own estimation or her own estimation. Now, we're sitting here facing a serious debt crisis. Some have said this debt crisis isn't here yet, so we have more time to deal with it. I reject that fact. I reject that because if $16.7 trillion of debt isn't a crisis, I don't know what is. And at the rate that we're going here in Washington, we don't have more time to waste. But don't take my word for this. Just last week, at a hearing in the Joint Economic Committee on the debt crisis, we found widespread agreement from the witnesses across the ideological spectrum on a variety of issues, including the vital importance of dealing with our long-term debt issue and dealing with it now in a timely fashion, reforming health and retirement security programs to rein in spending and preserve much-needed benefits. Let me relate some of that testimony. Former Senator and former Senate Chairman of the Budget Committee, Judd Gregg, who now serves as the co-chair of the Campaign to Fix the Debt, stated this: "On our current path, this nation goes bankrupt." Now that statement was, a similar statement was made by Judd Gregg, a Republican, by a Democrat, Erskine Bowles, who headed up the President's own fiscal commission. And former Governor Bowles and Chief of Staff to former President Clinton said this is the most predictable financial crisis in the history of the country that's looming. And this was several years ago. And nothing's gotten better since then. We just careen closer and closer to that tipping point. So Senator Gregg says on our current path, this nation goes bankrupt. He noted that mandatory spender is the primary driver of the debt. And I quote again, "Unfortunately, all of the measures put in place have ignored smart entitlement reforms to control spending over the long term and comprehensive tax reforms to make the tax code more efficient." We've all heard that before from people all across the political spectrum, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. There is a growing consensus that these elements must be addressed if we are to address our long-term debt problem. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, noted that, and I quote, "The level and projected growth of federal debt is a drag on the current U.S. economic growth and a threat to future prosperity. The nation," he said, "despite claims to the contrary, remains on a damaging debt pathway." Dr. Holtz-Eakin countered arguments that reducing the debt is not urgent because the crisis is a distant threat by pointing out that, and I quote again, pointing out the U.S. is already paying an economic price for the excessive federal debt in terms of slow job creation and growth. He went on to say the obvious conclusion is that additional deficit reduction is needed to avoid debt-driven economic stagnation. And he called for a strategy that shifts the focus of spending control to the needed entitlement reforms and shifts the debate on taxes away from harmful higher marginal tax rates in favor of pro-growth tax reform. Alice Rivlin, the first director of the Congressional Budget Office and co-chair of the Debt Reduction Task Force for the Bipartisan Policy Center, as well as a number of other distinguished positions that she's held, as well as also being a former resident of my home state, Indiana. She insisted on the importance of a long-term budget plan that will halt the projected rise in debt. She said, the prospect of debt growing faster than the economy for the foreseeable future reduces consumer and investor confidence, raises a serious threat of high future interest rates and unmanageable federal debt service, and reduces likely American prosperity and world influence. She stressed in her testimony the urgent need to act now to get the federal debt under control before events overtake us. A sense of urgency was unmistakably present during this hearing, and we read about it in the paper every day. We read it from columnists. We hear it on the radio and the television. We hear it on the talk shows. Why can't you get together and get this thing solved and resolved so we can move forward? You're holding down the growth of the economy. You're keeping people out of work. We're a stagnant growth, half of our historical average, coming out of a recession. And we all know that a significant percent of the money that we spend here has to be borrowed. It's borrowed from China, Saudi Arabia, from foreign entities. That is no way to sustain and maintain a healthy fiscal situation in this country. Our final witness at the hearing, Simon Johnson, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, called for significantly more long-term debt reduction than has been contemplated in many of the proposals thus far. Let me repeat that. Simon Johnson, not known as necessarily a right-wing or conservative economist, said that more long-term debt reduction than has been contemplated in many of the proposals so far need to be looked at, suggesting that the U.S. should aim at a national debt in the range of 40% to 50% of GDP rather than our current 90 to 100. And when discussing how much time we have to act, Dr. Johnson said, we have no idea, but we need to start now. Well, we absolutely should start now. We should be spending each day here working on long-term debt reduction plan, because unlike the haphazard, rushed legislation we have seen over the past few years, a real, credible, long-term fiscal plan cannot happen overnight. It requires bold spending reforms. It must include a way to restructure programs like Medicare and Social Security so that we can prevent them from going bankrupt and preserve benefits for current and future retirees. Let me state that again. Those of us who have stood up and taken the stand on dealing with these so-called political suicide issues, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, are saying that we need to do something now to prevent these programs from becoming insolvent or less solvent, to prevent benefits having to be reduced or massive tax increases on the next generation to be imposed in order to keep them solvent. We want to deal with that now so that we don't undermine these programs. Those who say we should not touch Medicare are simply saying, not being truthful with the current and former future beneficiaries of that program. And the same is for Social Security. They are simply saying, we don't want to take the tough decision now to address some of these problems and make sensible reforms. We'll be gone when this thing comes undone. But they're saying to people, we're going to turn our heads to the plight of future beneficiaries and even current beneficiaries of these programs by not doing anything. And so it's time we work together to find a solution to this. I think there also is a consensus that comprehensive tax reform is an area where we can find common ground, but is absolutely essential, as our witnesses all stated, essential to providing the growth element so that this country and this economy can begin to grow. Additional revenue will come in from a more prosperous nation and from a greater rate of growth. And that will help us reduce our deficit spending. It will help us move toward a balanced budget. And it will help us from continuing to plunge into more and more debt and more deficit. Comprehensive tax reform is the best way to reduce the debt, grow the economy, and make America more competitive. Grow the economy. Not grow more government, grow the economy. That is what makes us more competitive, puts more people back to work. That is what puts us on a path to American prosperity. Now, these things will not be easy. It will require time, and it will demand political will, and it will demand political courage. So let's get moving. Senate Majority Leader says, let's stop wasting time. I couldn't agree more. Mr. Majority Leader, allow members to offer their amendments. Your members, our members, ones we like, ones we don't like. We are set here to make the tough choices, to make our yes or our no, and represent people back home. That's what the Senate is all about. So instead of standing here, speaking to an empty chamber, members wondering, letting the clock run so that these amendments can be closed out and never offered under this bill, we should be debating these. And in doing so, we can get to the point where we will have our final vote, and hopefully we will be funding the government going forward. It's called regular business, and that ought to be our focus. Growing this economy and strengthening it for future generations is the challenge before us. It's the challenge of our time. We need political will and courage, boldness to go forward, but it's absolutely essential for the future of this country. And I suggest that instead of standing around doing nothing, we begin to address these issues. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
The Senate today continuing to work on the continuing resolution. That's a measure that would continue to fund the federal government through the end of 2013 fiscal year. That's through September. And Majority Leader Harry Reid saying today that he wants to finish that before the Easter recess. That's expected to take place at the end of this week. The Supreme Court will release audio recordings of next week's arguments in 2 gay marriage cases just a few hours after they finish. The Associated Press writes that the justices will hear arguments over California's ban on same-sex marriage on Tuesday and the Federal Defense of Marriage Act on Wednesday. And here at C-SPAN, we'll have same-day audio of those cases. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill today discussing the U.S. Airways plan to merge with AMR Corporation, the parent company to American Airlines, asked CEOs from the 2 companies if the deal would mean higher fares or reduced service for the U.S. flying public. We're going to watch that hearing as we continue to wait for a senator to speak.
Okay, we'll call the hearing today for the Antitrust Subcommittee. I want to thank everyone for being here today for my first subcommittee hearing as the chairman of this subcommittee. And Senator Lee, who's the ranking member, is, an old hand at this, but we thank all of you for coming today. I've long been concerned about the consolidation in the airline industry. For me, it was highlighted in 2008 when my hometown airline, Northwest Airlines, merged with Delta. At that time, it was widely predicted that that merger would usher in a wave of consolidation, and several mergers later, here we are with a large deal that would combine 2 of the nation's largest network carriers. 5 years ago, we had 6 major carriers, and should this merger be approved, we will be down to 3. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, American Airlines and U.S. Airways announced their proposal to merge. If the merger goes through, the new American Airlines would be the nation's largest carrier and result in the 4 top airlines controlling approximately 80% of the domestic airline market, and that includes Southwest. I approached this hearing with an understanding of the enormous challenges that the airlines industry has faced over the years. The attacks on September 11th, ever-increasing fuel costs in a volatile fuel market, and the economic downturn have all put airlines to the test. There is also significant global competition, which creates incentives to merge. I get that. But I also know that a strong and vibrant airline industry is critical to our country. Safe, reliable, and affordable air travel is essential to communities large and small. Strong air service attracts businesses and tourists, and that results in economic growth and jobs. But given how critical the airline industry is to the U.S. commerce and to public safety, we need to be vigilant in examining any potential challenges this merger might create, particularly in the context of affordability and accessibility of air service. With this merger coming on the heels of major airline consolidation, that would be Delta, Northwest, United Continental, Frontier and Republic, and Southwest Air Tram, this subcommittee and the Justice Department must review the concentration in the industry and what that means for services and prices, as well as airport accessibility in less popular but just as important destinations, particularly in rural areas. Baggage fees, change fees, seating fees are pervasive and increasing in the industry. Last year, legacy carriers took in more than $10 billion in fees. With fewer competing airlines, can we expect even more of these extra charges? Are the few low-cost carriers that remain enough to keep what would be the 3 legacy carriers and Southwest in check? And we need to know that fewer airlines won't mean fewer flights and diminished services for the airports that are not the major hubs. There will always be ample competition between major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. We all know that. But what about cities like Minneapolis or cities like Cincinnati, Memphis, Milwaukee, and Pittsburgh? What about a city like Rochester, Minnesota, home of the Mayo Clinic that's currently served by American Airlines? Service to all metropolitan areas and mid-sized and small cities is more important than ever, yet we have seen reduced service to certain mid-sized cities. We appreciate the goals here, the stated promise of complementary flight networks, increased efficiency, and offering more options for customers. But consumers have a right to be skeptical. When we have one fewer choice on that matrix of flight options while searching for fares on the Internet, consumers can't help but wonder, would an added competitor be fighting a little harder to get my business at a lower price? Or would an added competitor be able to offer me more convenient flight times connecting through a different hub? More important than the convenience issues is the potential impact on jobs. It's no small feat that the major unions here have supported the merger. Still, what we've seen with past airline mergers gives us reason for caution. I will say my home state of Minnesota was fortunate in that we retained most but not all of the jobs in Minnesota following the Delta Northwest merger. Delta is a major employer in our state, and we're proud of that. But in the wake of similar mergers, not every state has been so lucky. Mr. Parker and Mr. Horton, we understand and appreciate your reasons for advancing this merger. It's good for your bottom lines, and at the end of the day, you have to answer to your shareholders, and you are competing in a global marketplace. But on this subcommittee, we have to get answers for the people of this country, whether it's the American family looking for an affordable trip to Disneyland or looking to visit their grandma in Pittsburgh, or whether it's a small business owner looking for the best frequent flyer program. They want as many possible choices, and they want choices at affordable prices. And they want to know that no airline or no small group of airlines gains a stranglehold on the market. That's the reason we're here today, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and the thoughts of our other two witnesses. And we thank you for being here, and I now turn it over to Ranking Member Senator Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. The U.S. airline industry touches the lives of almost every American in some way or another. These airlines allow us to travel for business and for leisure, to meet new people and to reunite with loved ones. Air travel is also an important element of our national infrastructure, and it's critical to our economy. 1 in 8 American jobs depends in one way or another on travel and tourism, and analysts estimate that U.S. travel expenditures will total more than $850 billion in 2013. For all these reasons, Congress must take seriously any activity that will seriously and materially affect the airline industry. Our country has benefited greatly from airline deregulation ever since that began in 1978. Government control of this industry, like government management of any private enterprise, had unfortunate results. In the years since deregulation, airfares have dropped substantially, and options for travelers have simultaneously expanded. These benefits are the result of free market competition and will continue as long as the industry remains robustly competitive. Despite the positive benefits of deregulation, the story of our nation's airlines in recent decades is not one of unbroken, unmitigated success. Uneven earnings, volatile fuel costs, and structural changes have led to a long succession of airline bankruptcies. As federal agencies have provided assistance and assumed responsibility for many pension plans as a result of those airline bankruptcies, the financial stability of the airline industry is one of special concern. To help cope with changing circumstances, airlines have turned to consolidation. In the last decade alone, we've seen no fewer than 6 significant airline mergers in this country, and today we consider the 7th major merger, which would be an $11 billion transaction. The combined American and U.S. Airways would employ nearly 120,000 people, would have 2012 revenues of almost $40 billion, and fly 950 jets to approximately 900 locations. The merger would leave only 4 airlines.
Call. I'm sorry. Without objection.
Thank you. The quorum call being lifted, may I ask to speak for perhaps up to 15 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I noted last week the Republican leader came to his desk and he spoke about the budget, and he described our Democratic budget as a left-wing manifesto. Left-wing manifesto. We have done $1.8 trillion in spending cuts already. We raised $600 billion, a third of that, in revenue by restoring the Clinton-era tax rates for families earning over $450,000 a year. So in the balance between spending cuts and new revenues, it's already 3-to-1 in favor of spending cuts. And in our budget, we propose to fill the gap of the remainder with 50% spending cuts and 50% revenue. And that's a left-wing manifesto. The Republican budget changes Medicare into a voucher program. The Republican budget cuts non-defense discretionary spending to levels lower than at any time since OMB started keeping track a half a century ago. The Republican budget would set annual domestic spending at rates lower than 1962, when there were no Pell Grants at all, when 30% of American seniors lived in poverty. But that's not extreme. A Democratic budget that is 50-50 spending cuts and revenues, that's a left-wing manifesto. The Democratic budget has $975 billion in new spending cuts, and it has $975 billion in new revenue in order to close that budget gap 50-50. That means, including the deficit reduction that we've already done, this, of $1.8 trillion, we will be in total at $4.3 trillion in deficit reduction, which is probably just a little bit over the target that most of the experts have given us to hit. And about $2.8 trillion of that, of the $4.3, will come in spending cuts. $600 billion has come in new tax revenue, and $975 billion will come from loopholes, for a total of $1.6 trillion coming from new revenues. Some left-wing manifesto, $1 trillion more in spending cuts than revenue. At a time when billionaires in America are paying lower tax rates than brick masons, if that's a left-wing manifesto, then the left wing needs to fire its manifesto writers. Left-wing manifesto. That's some pretty high rhetoric. We know where the word manifesto comes from, of course. It comes from the Cold War and the communists. 50% spending cuts, 50% revenue, and the hint is, the rhetorical hint, is that we Democrats with our budget are a bunch of commies. That is high rhetoric indeed, and it's not coming from some fringe senator in their rank and file. This is the Republican leader of the United States Senate. Left-wing manifesto. In the face of the obvious facts of the balance of our budget, why might the rhetoric be getting so high? What might the Republicans be getting so touchy about? Well, let's look at where we get the rest of our revenue for our 50-50 budget. We got the first 600 from restoring the Clinton-era tax rates, a time of huge economic success for our country, for folks over $450,000 in income. Where do we get our $975 billion in new revenue? Well, we go to the Republican treasure trove. We go to Alibaba's cave for corporations and the rich. We go to the tax earmarks and the special deals that special interests have year after year squirreled away in the tax code. Now, people think, how much can that be? What can it mean when we have money going through the tax code and out, but not coming to the government in revenues? Well, what is in Alibaba's cave? How big is the treasure trove? Have a look. This is the amount of money that the United States government collects from individuals in taxes. $1.09 trillion. Here's how much goes back out the back door of the tax code to people who've got loopholes, special rates, deductions in the tax code that help them. $1.02 trillion. Virtually the same. For every dollar of revenues the United States collects in actual revenues from individual taxpayers every year, another 94 cents goes back out through the loopholes and the deductions and the special rates. A grand total every year of more than $1 trillion. And since we budget over a 10-year period, it's $10 trillion in this budget period. $10 trillion. On the corporate side, for every dollar of revenues the United States collects in actual revenues from corporations, another 87 cents goes back out the back door of the tax code through loopholes and special rates and deductions. And again, because we do this over, every year, $157 billion. And again, because we do this over 10 years, that's more than $1.5 trillion. If you add these two together, it's more than $11.5 trillion in the budget period. If you presume some modest growth in the economy over those 10 years, that number gets to about $14 trillion. So, Alibaba's tax code cave of tax spending is very big. There is lots of treasure squirreled away in it. And that doesn't even count the billions of dollars that corporations and wealthy tax avoiders hide offshore. So it never even gets into the tax equation. The IRS has pegged that recently at about $385 billion a year. There's one little building in the Cayman Islands that Chairman Conrad used to refer to regularly when he was chairman of the Budget Committee. One little building in the Cayman Islands, maybe 5 stories tall, where over 18,000 companies claim to be doing business. You can imagine what kind of business they're doing there. That's how $385 billion a year never even appears in the tax equation. So this spending that gets done through the tax code, that doesn't get reviewed by annual appropriations, it gets squirreled away in there and it's there to stay, it's a big treasure trove indeed. Not counting offshoring, probably $14 trillion in a 10-year budget period for those who are clever and connected enough to get their special deals, their tax earmarks, into the tax code. We take out of that, call it 14 trillion, at a minimum 11.5 trillion, 975 billion, about 7%. That's how much of it, this little red slice, is what we take to balance the budget for deficit reduction. The problem is the Republicans don't want us to look into their treasure trove. Alibaba's cave of tax tricks is where the juicy earmarks are for special interests. Want to know why Mitt Romney had to fiddle his taxes to get up to a 14% tax rate? Which, by the way, is a lower tax rate than a solitary hospital orderly pays walking down the halls of Rhode Island Hospital at night. How does he get it? So he has to fiddle his taxes to get up to a rate lower than a hospital orderly pays? How do Romney and the hedge fund billionaires pull that trick off? Look here in Alibaba's cave for the carried interest exception. Do you want to know where ExxonMobil, which is the richest and most profitable corporation in the history of the world, where ExxonMobil gets its hands into the American taxpayers' pockets? Look at the big oil subsidies in Alibaba's cave. Want to know how corporate jets get special favored tax treatment compared to the commercial jets that ordinary mortals fly? Look at the accelerated depreciation schedules in Alibaba's cave of tax tricks. If using the phrase left-wing manifesto seems a little strident, a little exaggerated about a budget proposal for 50% spending cuts and 50% revenues, and you want to inquire why, look no farther than the Republican treasure trove of corporate and special interest tax earmarks heaped up in Alibaba's cave. Well, we're knocking at the door. We are knocking on the door of Alibaba's cave, which so far has been untouched. We've done all spending cuts and a little bit of tax rate increase for families over $450,000 back to the Clinton-era rates. We haven't touched yet Alibaba's cave. What we're saying as Democrats is that Americans paid in deficit reduction spending cuts, that they're going to lose in services and in benefits $1.8 trillion. And they will pay in another $975 billion in cuts under our Democratic proposal. We're saying that folks over $450,000 a year income saw their tax rates go up to Clinton-era levels, and they're paying in another $600 billion in deficit reduction. And now we want to go into Alibaba's cave of tax earmarks. And out of at least $11.5 trillion, probably more like $14 trillion, and if you throw in the offshoring, that takes you up to $17, $18 trillion. We want to take less than $1 trillion out over 10 years to help reduce our budget deficit. So the Republicans are getting anxious. The alarms are ringing in the special interests, and the Republicans are rushing to the trenches to defend their special interests and their cherished tax earmarks. And the best defense being a good offense, that is how a balanced deficit reduction plan that in sum has $1 trillion more in spending cuts than in revenues, suddenly becomes a leftist manifesto. If you listen, we just had the hearings in the Budget Committee on our budget. If you listened in that committee, the Republicans said it plainly. They didn't mince words. Not a penny of tax loopholes, not a penny from Alibaba's cave of tax treasures can go for deficit reduction. Not a penny. That's their rule. They will say that they're willing to move the treasure around a little bit in Alibaba's cave, so long as it all gets used for corporations and the wealthy. Again, that's not a guess. That's in the Republican budget. None of the goodies squirreled away by the special interests over the years in Alibaba's cave for deficit reduction. None. All of it to lower tax rates for corporations and the rich, the ones who mostly benefit from the treasure in Alibaba's cave to begin with. They're willing to spread the treasure around a little as long as it stays in the hands of big corporations and the rich. Well, we are at the gates of Alibaba's cave, this treasure trove of tax code special deals and earmarks for the rich and the well-connected. We are at the place where the lobbyists wheel the sweet corporate tax deals. We're knocking on the door of the $14 trillion tax spending area that has been so far left completely untouched in deficit reduction. And so our Republican friends are getting a little twitchy. Come on, fellas. Out of nearly $14 trillion in tax spending and earmarks, can't we just put a little bit towards the deficit? Just 7%? Under their own budget, they take 41% of it and give it back in the form of lower high-end tax rates, lowered rates for big corporations and the rich. Can't we do just 7% for deficit reduction? I thought the deficit was so important, but maybe not when it comes to our friends protecting the interests of the big corporations and the rich. I thank the presiding officer, and I yield the floor.
Roll. Oh, now the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.